Thank you all for coming to this final day of our review sessions. Let's start by setting motivation. We will first recite the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer, three times in Tibetan and then once in English. Sangye cheran soki chonam la chanchu paru dani kyamsu chi dagi jinzogi pe sonam gi drola pencher sangye ju par shok sangye cheran soki chonam la chanchu paru dani kyamsu chi dagi jinzogi pe sonam gi drola pencher sangye ju par shok Sangye cheran soki chonam la chancho bado dane kyasu chi dagi jinsogi pe sonam gi indrola pencher sangye ju par shok. In the Buddha's Dharma and Sangha, until enlightened I seek refuge, through merit from giving and the rest. To aid all may I become Buddha. So we've gathered together this afternoon to reflect on the Holy Dharma, the holy words of our Guru, His Holiness Dalai Lama. And we've done this not to benefit ourselves alone, but so that we might be of more benefit to all sentient beings. So we engage in the activities of study, reflection, and meditation to improve our minds and improve our ability to be of service to others. For this reason, we come together. So, it's good to see you all here again. Teaching today was quite wonderful, yeah? But they always are, of course. His Holiness didn't cover a lot of new material in the teaching today. It was mostly discussing the defaults or the defects of a self-grasping mind and the importance of bodhicitta. So yesterday, you noticed, and the way he did discuss outside of the transmission was mostly on wisdom of emptiness, and today was on bodhicitta. And in the same way that he gave us the meditation yesterday on the all yoga mind, which combined bodhicitta and the wisdom understanding emptiness. Those are the two main topics he taught as well over the 3 days, in addition to the Pramanavartika. So most of what he discussed today, we've already covered in the review sessions. So what I thought I would do is go over some of the big points that I heard him speak about today that I think would be good to review, especially how to generate different methods of generating bodhicitta. And then since he offered the bodhisattva vows today, I thought I'd go over the 12-line verse of 12-line prayer of generating bodhicitta and taking the bodhisattva vows, as well as the 18 root downfalls and so forth that he mentioned as part of that. So that's the plan. Hopefully and then we'll open up to questions for anything that has come up over the last 3 days. That's great. We are going to be offering a Guru Puja here at 6:30 in one of the other gompas. So we're really going to try to end on time, if not maybe a few minutes early, just to make sure that some of us have time to prepare for that puja, and you're all invited to that as well, if you like. But so that's our time frame and our overview, okay? You know, one of the first things that His Holiness mentioned today was a reminder that the Buddha became enlightened on the basis of bodhicitta, as well as all of the practices that accompany bodhicitta. And just in the same way, in the Pramanavartika, or really in the Pramana Samuccaya, in that first verse, it says transformed into the supreme kind, right? He became enlightened. That's reminding us that we all have the exact same capacity to become Buddhas that Shakyamuni Buddha did. Okay, right now we're sentient beings. Right now we exist under the whims of karma and delusions. But if we engage in the practice, we can become perfected beings, beings with perfectly omniscient minds who are able to work solely for the benefit of others in never-ending bliss and happiness. So that's possible for every one of us. And so just that small reminder, Shakyamuni became the Buddha. He created the causes and conditions that allowed him to achieve enlightenment. And so those are the exact same causes and conditions that we are now working to create. The exact same. It's easy to forget that when we look at how far we have to go and how much suffering we experience and how difficult our lives may be. It's easy to forget that we have the capacity to become Buddhas. And not just us, but all sentient beings. There's a theory or a term called Tathagata Garbha in Sanskrit. Tathagata means the Buddha, the one thus gone. And Garbha is a seed or essence. And so it's often translated as the seed of enlightenment or the seed, the essence of the Tathagata. And then it says that all sentient beings have that essence, which means every sentient being has the exact same capacity to become an enlightened being, from the smallest ant to the most, worshipped of long life gods. Every sentient being has the same capacity. Now, they don't all have the same circumstances, right? Right now, we have a perfect human rebirth, which are the ideal circumstances, really the only circumstances that you can use to travel the whole path to liberation. So it's important to remember, just because all beings have the capacity, we have uncommon circumstances that we need to make use of, okay? We can't waste this rare opportunity we have. It's especially important to remember when other beings harm you or engage in negative actions toward you. They have the same capacity to become a Buddha that I do. That's part of the development of equanimity, which is important when you're trying to generate bodhicitta. But even though we have this capacity to become a Buddha, and we know the causes and conditions that are necessary to get there, why aren't we there yet? The self-cherishing mind is the core answer. Now, as we said yesterday, the mind that grasps that the self is truly existent is really the root of samsara, yeah? But in our everyday lives, possibly an even stronger presence is the self-grasping mind. The self-cherishing mind. The mind that says, I am more important than other beings. And as long as we allow that mind to be what is at the core of our heart, that guides all our decisions, we won't find even mundane happiness in this life. Never mind happiness of Buddhahood in the future. Because the self-cherishing mind isn't focused on real happiness. It's focused on clinging and attachment. It's focused on worldly concerns. So even though we might experience things we identify as temporary happiness, they aren't substantially proven to be happiness. They're just temporary, superfluous, as long as they come from the self-cherishing mind or from one of the 8 worldly concerns. So we need to destroy the self-cherishing mind and cultivate the mind that cherishes others as more important. That's the heart of the practice of a bodhisattva. And so a lot of the practice is actively thinking about the advantages of a mind that cherishes others and the disadvantages of a self-cherishing mind. Those are 2 parts of one of the meditations we'll discuss later today, but it comes up over and over again. And one of the reasons that His Holiness has such fondness for Shantideva's text, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is because in many of the chapters, it has very clear verses discussing the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the advantages of cherishing others. So even reading that text, by reading that text and meditating on its meaning, it means you're meditating on those points, which makes it very easy for us, right? Of course, the main way to abandon all of the afflictions as well as their imprints is to generate a mind that recognizes the nature of reality, the wisdom, understanding emptiness. So this has to be conjoined with bodhicitta, as we mentioned yesterday. And that is what will lead us to Buddhahood. But most of today's teachings was focusing solely on bodhicitta, but he always reminded us, we need these two aspects, method and wisdom, because if one on their own will not be beneficial. Excuse me, they'll be beneficial, but it's not enough to become Buddha, to be free from suffering. He said, His Holiness reminded us that, if we look at the many practices that we engage in, the different types of meditation that Buddhism teaches us, especially the more you practice Tibetan Buddhism, you see there's lots of different tantric practices and deity yoga, as His Holiness referenced it today, which are these very subtle meditations on recognizing yourself as a Buddha. And he said, developing bodhicitta is more powerful to bring about inner and outer peace than deity yoga, than these really high, complicated practices. Okay? So this is the core practice. And everything else grows out of it, So let's talk about generating bodhicitta. I'm looking through some of the interesting points during the Q&A session, but they don't kind of go in a linear order, so we'll get to those a little later maybe. So in our tradition, we generally say there are two main methods or meditations we use to generate bodhicitta. One of them is called the sevenfold cause and effect meditation. And one of them is called the meditation on exchanging self and others. And that's the one His Holiness mentioned today, as taught by Shantideva. Interestingly, so this was taught by Shantideva. And if you read the Bodhicharyavatara, the Bodhisattva's way of life, you see all the points in it, and he has a strong emphasis on the importance of exchanging self and others. But you don't have specific or detailed meditation instructions, right? That text is a series of verses giving you advice on what to do, explaining the disadvantages of self-cherishing and so forth, but it's not a step-by-step meditation guide. And for a long time, exchanging self and others was only practiced secretly. So we know that tradition came to Tibet from India. Shantideva was an 8th century practitioner in India. And his text, the Bodhicharyavatara, was quite popular. So you read many of the texts from Tibet and they cite it, right? Because it's so important. But you look at a teacher's teaching and he cites Shantideva, he only taught exchanging self and others in private. He taught it to one disciple, to his main disciple, Jomtompa, or one of his 3 main disciples, Jomtompa. That's the only one he taught it to. Because he said this is a secret practice. Because it's very easy to misunderstand it. And Jomtompa himself only taught it to one disciple. He taught it to his disciple Pothuwa. That's it, one person. And he only taught it to 2 people. Okay, Geshe Charwa and Tangulamba. So there are generations of this teaching that stayed in secret, even though Shantideva did give a rough outline of it over 200 years earlier. This teaching was known, but not practiced widely, and not given to public audiences. But then Langri Tampa wrote the 8 verses of mind transformation, which is a very famous text. And he kind of hints about the idea of exchanging self and others in that text. And so Geshe Kekwa read that text and said, I need to study with Langri Tampa and understand this. And he went to where Langri Tampa was, and Langri Tampa had already passed away. So he started studying with Geshe Charwa instead. And at that point, he learned the meditation on exchanging self and others. And he meditated on it and decided it was so powerful and important, he started teaching it publicly. But so it was 5 generations of student and disciple teaching before it became a public teaching that we have it now. And the only reason I think that's important to remember is to show how powerful this teaching can be and this type of meditation. It's not something that can just be easily done. It takes effort, but it also has great power in that same regard.
Of course, these days, they often advise combining the two. And so I'll talk us through what it means to combine the 7-point cause and effect, as well as exchanging self and others. So we won't lead any meditation this evening, but I'll go through the steps that you would do in a meditation. So I think we might have mentioned this the other day, but when we talk about meditation, in Tibetan, it's the word gom, which means to become familiar with something. And the translator, at least the English language translator, would often say, you have to become familiar with bodhicitta. He's translating, you have to meditate on bodhicitta. That's what he's translating. It's the same term. So we meditate in order to become familiar with our mind, to understand our mind. And so we have two basic types of meditation: stabilizing meditation, which we use to allow our mind to become single-pointed, focused, and to develop calm and a sense of equilibrium. And then once we've developed that stable mind, we do analytical meditation. And there are different types of analytical meditation, but that's meditation that uses thought. You know, it's not a meditation devoid of thought. We use thoughts. So it may be thinking of using logic to understand the meaning of an important topic. That's the type of meditation, okay? Or it may be trying to generate bodhicitta, trying to generate love or compassion. These are all analytical meditations. So at the beginning of any meditation session, if you haven't already achieved calm abiding, which means you have an effortless single-pointed concentration that's marked by the incredible bliss of physical and mental pliancy. So if you haven't achieved that, then we start most of our meditation sessions with a little bit of stabilizing meditation. We can focus on a single object and allow our mind to stay focused on that just for a few minutes to allow our mind to get into the right kind of space to then engage in analytical practice. So the most common object of meditation that's advised in the beginning is the breath, because the breath is a neutral object, and since it's always with our bodies, it's very easy to return to it again and again. And the second object often advised is an image of the Buddha, of Shakyamuni Buddha. Not a physical one, but a mental one that you project. And that's a virtuous object. So that's actually a more powerful type of meditation, because then you're engaging in virtue even in a more strong way, because the object of your meditation is virtuous. But the breath is neutral and it's easier, so we often start there. So you'd start any analytical meditation with a few minutes of stabilizing meditation, focusing on the breath. And depending on your circumstance, how much time you have, how crazy your mind is, how busy your day has been, that can help determine how long you want to have that section of your meditation, you know? So then the meditation on the 7-point cause and effect meditation is so called because it has the first 6 steps of it are the cause for bodhicitta, and the 7th is the result, cause and effect, and that's bodhicitta. But before you get to those 7, you first start by meditating on equanimity. So equanimity is realizing, as we've said over and over again, that all sentient beings are the exact same in their wish for happiness and their wish not to suffer. There's no distinction. And the way we usually do a meditation on equanimity is we visualize 3 different people in front of us from our lives. Someone we label enemy, someone we label a friend, and someone we label a stranger. So those are representing our 3 root delusions, or our root poisons of anger, attachment, and ignorance. And we see that that person we've labeled an enemy is only receiving that label due to circumstances. But in the past, they may have benefited us. And definitely in a past life, they benefited us, if not in this life. And in the future, they may help us as well. So right now, we give them this label of enemy, but that label has no substance. It's just a projection. And in the same way, the person we identify as a friend, at this moment, due to circumstances, we have this experience of attachment towards them like a friend. But in the past, they have hurt us, whether in this life or past lives, and that can definitely cause us harm in the future. So in the same way that the label enemy, it has no substance, the label friend has no substance. And the person we identify as a stranger is due, again, to circumstance. In the past, they've helped us or hurt us. In the future, they will again. So this label of stranger is a mere projection. So these 3 labels are mere projections of our minds of ignorance, attachment, and anger. They don't have any substantial meaning. And on top of that, all three of those beings have the same wish to be free from all suffering and the same wish for happiness that we have. There's no distinction between them. So you generate this mind that sees no distinction between these three beings, these three types of beings. And then once you do that, you can extend that to all sentient beings. So you start with three that you have a relationship in this life, and then they become representative of all beings, because our relationship to all beings is going to either be one of attachment, anger, or ignorance. And so once you realize that those three types of relationships, there's no difference between them, and there's no difference between the objects of those relationships, then you develop a sense of equanimity that sees everyone in the same way, has the same level of deservingness of happiness, and so forth. So that's the first step. That's the preliminary step. Then the next step, which is the first of the seven after the preliminary, is we recognize that all sentient beings have been our mother. And so as we believe that we've been reborn again and again in samsara, beginningless time, every sentient being has at some point been our mother. And so this requires some sort of confidence in rebirth, which is, we talked about especially the first day, right? How this text proves the existence of previous lives through understanding the causes and conditions that cause a mind to come into being. So we don't say all sentient beings are like our mother. We say they have been our mother. And due to circumstances, they're not a mother in this life, but they all have been our mother in a past life. And so then once we develop a strong conviction that all sentient beings have been our mother, we remember the incredible kindness of our mother. All of the pain and suffering our mother went through to carry us in her womb, to give birth to us, then to give us food and shelter, to provide for us an education. They say a mother's love for their child is so strong, they often even will engage in negative activities just to make sure that child has happiness. So a mother is willing to create more suffering for herself just so we could have opportunities. And now it's possible, this comes up a lot in the West, a lot of us don't have that friendly of a relationship with our mother. In 21st century Westerners, that's common. That's okay. But we can recognize that that is a common type of relationship between mother and child, especially as this one was saying, between mammals. And so even if we don't have that experience in this life, we can still generate the mind that recognizes the importance of that level of emotion and that level of kindness. So once we recognize all sentient beings as our mother, and we remember the kindness of our mother, we develop the strong wish to repay that kindness. So that's the third step in this meditation. We develop a strong wish that I must repay this kindness. How could I have only happiness for myself when my dear mother is suffering? Then after we develop that strong wish or intention, we meditate on great love. So great love is wishing that our kind mother sentient beings have all happiness and the causes of happiness. So that's the first. That's the next meditation. We meditate on love. Generate the mind of love. The next is great compassion. So great compassion is wishing all sentient beings to be free from suffering and all the causes of suffering. So love and compassion are like two sides of the same coin. One is wishing for happiness, and one is wishing for the freedom from suffering of all sentient beings. And the reason we call this great love and great compassion is because it has as its object all sentient beings, not just one being or a few beings. So recognize sentient beings as our mother. First, develop equanimity, then recognize sentient beings as our mother. Remember their kindness, develop the wish to repay their kindness, meditate on great love, meditate on great compassion. Then we develop what is called the excellent intention or the universal responsibility, which is we develop the mind that actually says, I will bring my mother every happiness and remove all of her suffering. So it's no longer a wish, but a promise in that way. We take that responsibility on ourselves. And then those conclude the causes And then the last step is actual bodhicitta. And so the final step is meditating on bodhicitta, the wish to achieve perfect, complete enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And so that isn't that different than the special intention. It's very, very similar, but it's even stronger than that intention. And so that's the final step of that meditation. So in our practice, we go through all those steps one at a time. And you might find that some steps are easier for you than others. And so maybe that step you focus on for 5 minutes. Then maybe there's a step that's more difficult, so you focus on it for 10 minutes, or however long you need to really develop strong conviction. You know, depending on your time and circumstances, you can do this meditation in a very short way or in a very elaborate way. Once you know the steps and the outline, then you can see what fits your situation. We talk about bodhicitta, you know, we say that actual bodhicitta, real bodhicitta, or conventional bodhicitta we're talking about, exist in the minds of beings who actually enter the Mahayana paths. So it's conjoined with effortless renunciation. So the minds of bodhicitta we have isn't actual bodhicitta. We use the term bodhicitta to describe it, okay? And it's like a facsimile or a similitude of bodhicitta. So when we talk about generating bodhicitta in our mind, or the mind of bodhicitta rather, or the mind of enlightenment, it's sometimes called, we can recognize it's not actual bodhicitta, but it's the best we can do. And that explains why it isn't as strong and it isn't effortless, you know? And the more we engage in these practices, it becomes stronger and stronger and requires less and less effort. And all of our physical actions become immediately inspired by and motivated by the intention of bodhicitta. We don't have to think about it anymore. That's what perfect bodhicitta feels like. But for now, since we haven't entered the Mahayana path, we haven't developed effortless renunciation, our bodhicitta is like a baby version of that. That's okay, because that's where we are. You know, we're doing the best we can do. And every day we try to do a little better than the day before. But so we talk about bodhicitta, this is an important thing to remember. That my bodhicitta doesn't look like the bodhicitta of an actual bodhisattva, because I'm still working towards that goal. But it will get there if I put in the effort. So that's the first meditation we are advised to do in our lineage. It's called the sevenfold cause and effect, even though it actually has 8 steps, because they add equanimity in to the beginning. And then you have the meditation on exchanging self and others. And the way this is generally taught is in 4 steps, sometimes with a 5th added on. So the first, they often advise you to meditate on equanimity as well. So that's not officially one of the steps, but it always makes it easier to generate bodhicitta if you start there. Then the official first step is equalizing self and others. And so by equalizing, we're recognizing, it's very similar to equanimity, but instead of saying all the sentient beings are the same in their wish for happiness and suffering, we realize that they're equal to me in their wish for happiness and suffering. And so some of the rationale we can use is say, well, I'm only one being, but sentient beings are numberless. Therefore, their wish for happiness is actually more important than mine. And there are other similar techniques to think of why is other sentient beings' happiness more important than my own. And when we think of those ideas, we're able to equalize the wish for happiness and the wish to be free from suffering of other sentient beings and ourselves. So first we develop this mind of equalization. Very similar to equanimity, but it includes the recognition that other sentient beings' wish for happiness is actually more important than my own. And then we meditate on the disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. So this is an opportunity where a text like Shantideva's can be very, very beneficial, because you can look at some of those verses and recite that verse to yourself over and over again as part of your meditation and really meditate on the meaning of it, you know? But even without a prompt like that, you can think, what are some of the disadvantages of self-cherishing mind? And the way we can think about that is, think of someone you know in this life who has an incredibly strong ego. This is like the exaggerated version of it. But think of someone who is incredibly egotistical. Is that person well liked by others? Are they trusted? You know, how do they treat others? Look at their life and see all the difficulties that come from that incredibly strong ego. And you can see the many disadvantages of that exaggerated version. So the self-cherishing mind is similar, but it's much more subtle, and the disadvantages are actually more insidious because they're not as easy to recognize, which is why it's helpful to have prompts like Shantideva's text and other texts. But even on a gross level, we can see how in this world, someone who has a very strong mind that only cares about themselves, it's very easy to see how that causes harm to them and to others. So after the meditating of equalizing, we reflect on the disadvantages of a self-cherishing mind. Then we reflect on the advantages of a mind that cherishes others as more important than ourselves. And in the same way, in a coarse level, look at someone who is incredibly humble and kind, and just think all the advantages of a life like that. How many people look up to them? How many look to them for advice and support? You know, how fewer obstacles do they have because they're so calm and they have such humility? So on a course level, we can see that not having that kind of mind is beneficial. And through studying more texts and having more contemplation on the topic, we can realize more and more advantages of the mind that cherishes others is more important than ourselves. So that's the third part of this meditation. And then the last one, the last part, is the actual exchanging of self and others. And what that means is actually exchanging your happiness for others and their suffering for your own. So you engage in practices that actually tries to take on their suffering and give them your happiness. And now we know this is a visualization. We can't give others our happiness. We can't take our suffering away from them. If we could take suffering away from other beings, none of us would suffer, because the Buddha would have already taken away all of our suffering. So we realize that we can't do this in the real world, but we can engage in this visualization practice. And what that does is it helps train our mind to really get rid of our self-cherishing mind and to care more about others. And it creates the causes and conditions for others to experience happiness. It doesn't create some sort of magical feat where I can wave a wand over you and make you not suffer, but it creates in me the mind that helps create external circumstances where your happiness can actually flourish and your freedom from suffering can flourish. And it creates the habit of my mind of working for others. And now often added to these 4 steps is the meditation on Tonglen. And Tonglen and exchanging are very similar. So Tonglen is called the meditation of giving and taking. Tong means to give, Len means to take. And actually in the practice, you do the taking first, which is you take other beings' suffering onto yourself. And the way this is often taught is you visualize the other beings in front of you who are suffering, and you actually visualize their suffering in whatever form it may be. If they're hell beings, you visualize their suffering as flames that come from them and are absorbed into your body. And they're absorbed right into your heart where your self-cherishing mind is, and they break your self-cherishing mind to pieces. That suffering you take from them. If they are hungry, then you visualize their suffering as, the lack of food and drink they have. So you can think of specific sufferings of beings and actually visualize those specific sufferings coming from them and you taking them on willingly. And those sufferings absorbing into your heart and destroying your self-cherishing mind. Or you can do a more general visualization where whatever sufferings they have take the form of like a black, inky kind of smoke. And that smoke you absorb into your heart. So instead of the actual depictions of their individual sufferings, just their suffering in general, you can picture in that way. And that's the act of taking. And once you develop that mind, they say you can join taking with the breath. So every time you breathe in, you take the suffering from other beings into your own self-cherishing mind. And then after taking, you meditate on giving. So giving is giving away your happiness. And the visualization for that is you visualize your body emanating out infinite numbers of bodies, and those bodies taking the form of whatever sentient beings need to get rid of their suffering. So if sentient beings are hungry, your body transforms into food and it relieves their hunger. If they're suffering from heat, your body transforms into a cool rain and calms them and cools them. So you can visualize your body manifesting these individual antidotes to their suffering. Or a more general, your body emanates out infinite numbers of bodies, which then take the form of pure white light and are absorbed into other sentient beings, and that brings them happiness. So that's the more general visualization you can do. But it's still your body emanating out and transforming into that happiness. And then you add that to your breath, and that goes onto your out breath. So as you breathe in, you take their suffering. And then as you breathe out, you give them your happiness. And so you first start just with taking, then just with giving, and then you combine them, especially on your breath. And so that's Tonglen practice. And it's often added to the end of exchanging self and others. So those are the two most common techniques we use to generate bodhicitta and to meditate on bodhicitta. Now, the one other technique I'll say is just combining those. And so the way they advise us to combine it, or one way, takes 11 steps. So first is equanimity, of course. And then recognizing all sentient beings to be our mother and remembering their kindness. So the first 3 steps are the same as the sevenfold. But then the 4th step is uncommon. We remember all sentient beings' kindness to us when they weren't our mother. Because there are lives when sentient beings were not our mother, but were still incomparably kind to us. And that widens our mind even more. So that's the 4th step. It's uncommon. Remembering the kindness of sentient beings when they were not our mother. And then we engage in the meditation on equalizing. And then we reflect on the disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. Then the 7th step is reflecting on the advantages of the mind that cherishes others. Then the 8th step, first we meditate on compassion, which is wishing to take suffering. And through the meditation of compassion, we do the Tonglen practice of taking. So when we remove other suffering, we wish them to be free of it, we take their suffering away. So we meditate on compassion combined with Tonglen practice of taking. Then we meditate on love, which is giving them happiness. So that's combined with the Tonglen practice of giving. That's the 9th step. Then the 10th step is again that universal responsibility, or the exceptional or extraordinary intention, the conviction, I will actually give all sentient beings every happiness, take away their suffering. And then the 11th step is bodhicitta itself, the firm resolve, I will become a Buddha for all sentient beings. So in this way, we combine both lineages of practice into one technique, into these 11 steps. So these are the most common ways that generating a mind of bodhicitta is instructed in our lineage. The more and more we practice them, the easier they get. And you can combine steps and it becomes natural. But at first, the reason they give us all these steps is because our minds are so in such disarray, we need this kind of structure, right, to help us. So, okay, let's see. What else did this one talk about? He reminded us the importance of the Bodhicharya Vitara. He said, if you have this text, you should all have this text, first off, and you should read it every day. You should keep it on your nightstand. And if you keep it in a bookshelf or something, it should be sticking out so you can grab it easily. It shouldn't get lost among your other books. It's how important it is, you know. And the wonderful thing about the text is it's in verse and they're all very like short and concise. So you can just take it almost like a page a day calendar. You take it in the morning, you read 5 or 10 verses, and then you can meditate on them. You don't have to read the whole text every day, but you take little pieces of it. The first chapter is all about the importance of bodhicitta. And then as the chapters go, there's a chapter covering each of the 6 perfections of a bodhisattva. So a whole chapter talking about the importance of generosity. And one all about the importance of patience. And then moral discipline, you know, in diligence, effort. concentration, wisdom, and so forth. So in this case, it shows the whole journey of a Bodhisattva. That's why it's called the way of the Bodhisattva. Fitting title. But so this text, there's many different translations of it, some from the Sanskrit and some from the Tibetan. And some are more accurate word by word than others. Some are more poetic in the translation. Some are based on commentaries. So you might find different translations that speak to you differently. You know, I know there's one translation I used to read, and it was maybe the first one I ever encountered, which just the poetry of it, I really, really enjoy. And then as I learned Tibetan, I realized it's not the best translation in terms of word for word. It kind of glosses over things, you know, but it's based on a teacher's commentary, but still it's a little bit loose with some of it. But the poetry is so beautiful that it speaks to me really well. So I still really appreciate that translation, even knowing it isn't word for word perfect. So you can go look, and there are many translations available. So I encourage you to seek, you know, this text out. The Bodhicharyavatara. Sometimes they call it the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. And in English, it has all different titles. The Way of the Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, the Deeds of a Bodhisattva. You know, look for something with Bodhisattva in the title, you're probably halfway there. But His Holiness reminded us how important this is. And he says he studies this every day. You know, it's very kind of His Holiness to tell us some of the practices he does every day, because then we have the opportunity to actually engage in the same practices our teacher is doing, which is a really wonderful thing. It brings us even closer to the holy activities of our Guru. He talked about the 8 dissolutions when he's talking about the subtle mind. And I won't go into this too much, but since he mentioned it on 2 different days, I thought I'd just give you the outline of what he was talking about so you can understand it. It's a very complicated topic because it has to do with how we understand the mind, especially according to highest Yoga Tantra. He was saying when you understand the very, very subtle levels of mind, it's much easier to recognize that the mind goes from one birth, this very, very subtle mind goes from one life to another. And that is how past and future lives exist on a continuum of mind that isn't broken. So he did mention it more than once. And so I'll go through the 8 steps of dissolution that happen at the time of death that display the distinction between coarse minds and subtle minds. But just know this is a very quick overview. But the point is, when we die, at the time of death, our minds slowly, one by one, dissolve in an expected order, in an order that we understand and we know. And now there are occasions when this happens very quickly, especially in the cases of traumatic deaths. He said, like people that die in war, or people that have very traumatic, instantaneous, violent deaths like that. Sometimes all 8 of these can happen very quickly. But in general, they don't happen quickly. They happen a little more slowly. And the reason it's important to study them is we can actually recognize them at the time of death. And that allows our practice to become stronger and have less fear, have more recognition of what's going on. So it's very useful to know these 8 dissolutions. And if you are to continue studying and practicing, and you engage in tantric practice, there are practices where you actually go through these 8 as a meditative practice as part of the tantric meditation, to make ourselves familiar with these now while we're alive, so we don't get scared and confused later. So we talked about there being 5 aggregates, right? We mentioned these, the form aggregate, and then that's combined with 4 mental aggregates. And it's upon those 5 aggregates, in dependence on those, that we impute the idea of a self. We talked about that quite a bit yesterday. So of these 5, they disintegrate or dissolve at different rates. So first, the form aggregate is the first one to dissolve. And we still have our bodies, but as it dissolves, it means it loses its power. And that's associated with the earth element in our body. So we say that our body has the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind. So as the form element dissolves, the earth element dissolves, and our I consciousness, which is one of the coarse 5 sense consciousnesses, that starts to dissolve as well. So we lose the ability to see clearly. We see things that are very vague, and our body feels very heavy as our earth element has dissolved. So that's the first coarse dissolution. And then the feeling aggregate dissolves. And as that dissolves, that's associated with the element of water. So our body fluids dry up. Our mouth becomes very dry. Our eyes lose all of their moistness, you know. And that's associated with the ear consciousness. That's the coarse consciousness. So as our feeling aggregate dissolves, we lose our ability to hear clearly and our bodies dry out. And then the element of discrimination, touche, this dissolves. This is associated with the fire element. So all of our inner heat starts to dissipate. We lose the ability to digest food. We develop cold feelings all the time. And this is associated with the smell consciousness. And so we lose the ability to smell strongly. And then the fourth of the coarse dissolutions is the compositional factors. That aggregate dissolves. That's associated with the wind or the coarse wind. And that is when our heart generally stops beating and we stop breathing. So at this point, we've only gone through 4 dissolutions, yet Western science would say we've died. And Buddhism says, no, there's still 4 more to go, you know, just relax a little bit. But by all outer appearances and by all Western science, our heart will be beating, we won't have any brain activity, more likely than not. That's one of the things this Holiness is working with some scholars to actually investigate right now. But so those are the first 4 coarse dissolutions. So our ear, our eye, ear, nose, and taste, those sense consciousnesses dissolve along with those 4 aggregates. And the last aggregate is the consciousness aggregate. And that one slowly dissolves over the next 4 steps. So the 5th dissolution, which is the consciousness aggregate getting weaker, we lose what are called the 8 indicative conceptual minds. The AD, not AD. Doesn't matter what they are, just it's important just to know this is the step. Okay, this is what's dissolving. It's a more subtle type of mind. As opposed to the sense consciousness, it's a more subtle mind, or 80 of them in this case. And the sign that we've achieved this is we have what's called the white appearance, the mind of white appearance. So everything appears to be brilliantly white. Because at this point, our eye consciousness is no longer functioning, right? Our body is physically dead by all Western measurement. Our mind still has, it still has objects appearing to it. So what appears is the white appearance. Then the 6th dissolution, as the consciousness aggregate continues to get weaker, that white appearance dissolves. And next is what's called the mind of red increase. So we see like the dawn's light in the fall, when the sun rises in autumn time, that brilliant red light rising, that's the next appearance we have. At the time of the 6th dissolution, when the white appearance dissolves, we have the red increase. And then the 7th dissolution is that red increase dissolves. And we have what's called the black near attainment. So all the appearance to our mind at that point is black, this darkness. And then when that final dissolution happens, the 8th one, we are only left with the mind of clear light, the subtle clear light mind. So this is the most subtle mind. And that's the mind that travels from one life to the next. That's the mind that, upon which karma is enacted, you know. That's how actions in a past life continue to ripen in future lives. Because the subtle, incredibly subtle, clear light mind has a continuum that doesn't end. And it's a continuum that won't end even when we become Buddhists. It'll be the same continuum of mind. It'll just be purified entirely. So this is the most subtle mind. And it's one that says that if you're able to actually understand these levels of mind, then we can realize how past and future lives happen. And because of this, we can realize there's no need to posit an external creator being who has some sort of unchanging permanence or effects on our lives. And it helps us realize how important our own power is in developing our mind and our relationships. We have nothing external to ourselves. So those are the 8 dissolutions. It's a very advanced topic, but His Holiness did mention it numerous times yesterday and today. So I thought it'd be good just to give them. And even at our beginner level, it's good to understand them, to become familiar with this idea that death, for most of us, doesn't happen like this. There are stages that we can be ready for, that we can clue into, that we can practice. The moment of death, they say, sometimes Dharma practice is considered, all of the practice in our life is all done for the moment of death. Because if you die with an incredibly angry or disturbed mind, then the karma that's going to ripen to determine where you're reborn will usually be a negative one. Even if you planted millions of positive karmas and millions of negative karmas, what determines which one ripens into a future rebirth? It's the mind at the moment of death, which is why it's so important to have a peaceful death. And engaging in meditations like this on the dissolutions can make that easier. His Holiness also talked about the importance of studying great texts. He mentioned Dharmakirti and Nagarjuna's texts that we were talking about the last couple of days, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika and the Madhyamaka Vatara. And he said it's important for us to study great texts, but also when we have teachers, to have teachers that understand those texts. And it's very trendy, maybe, to use shorter texts or easier texts and to teach from those. And that's fine if you can have knowledge of the greater text to use as support and basis. But if you're only teaching off of these minimal texts, then you're not getting the whole picture. And it suggests that the teacher doesn't have a strong understanding of the concept, that they only have light understanding. So we ourselves should study these great texts, and we should expect our teachers to know them as well. That doesn't mean that they teach us those texts directly, but it means that they have an understanding of them so they can bring in the reasoning and quotations and logic from those texts to all of their teachings. If any of you have ever studied Tantra at all, you know that we do what's called sadhanas. So these are practices of generating oneself as whatever Buddha you've taken an initiation into. And you often have long sadhanas and short sadhanas. And it goes through the different steps of this meditation practice. And the long ones are usually around 40 minutes to an hour to get done for a normal person. And the short ones, sometimes you can do in 10 minutes, you know. And so when you take an initiation, you're often given a commitment. You have to do the sadhana every day. Not always, depending on the Lama, but you receive, in exchange for receiving an initiation, you promise to do this. So everyone thinks, well, I'll just do all these short sadhanas. And they say the short sadhanas are for those who have already realized what's going on, you know, those are really strong intellects. They don't need all these steps laid out before them, you know, because they already have internalized all those steps. So then the short one is okay, because they have all the steps in their mind already. So in the same way, on a sutra level, when you have a strong understanding of the greater texts, the long texts, the classical texts, then you can find these shorter texts that contain the pith points, and you bring your understanding of the greater text to the condensed texts. So you don't need one or the other. You can use both together. But it's important to have a basis in these really classical texts. Another student asked, how do we notice our mental afflictions as they arise? We've talked about this the last couple of days. And the easy answer is we engage in practices to become familiar with our mind, which is to say, we meditate. And even just developing stabilizing meditation, right, lets us realize how our mind works in a much easier way. Until you look at your mind, you don't realize how often your activities are motivated by anger or attachment. Until you do practices to examine the 8 worldly concerns, you don't realize how many of your daily activities are motivated by one of those. And so the mere act of engaging meditation and becoming familiar with our mind then lets us see when those negative afflictions arise more quickly. That is how we recognize them. Now, recognizing them isn't the same as eliminating them, but it's the first step, and it's a critical step. You know, when you realize that I actually have a strong experience of anger right now, then you can do something about it. So for instance, today at the teachings, especially at the end of the teachings today, as it got close to His Holiness leaving, I was sitting on the lower level, the same place I sat every day, and a whole lot of people came into this area because they wanted to be near where His Holiness was leaving to maybe, just be in His Holiness's sight line at the end of the, because it was our last opportunity. So all of a sudden, this comfortable place we were sitting had another 15, 20 people in it who came right at the end, who were not considered any of us that were sitting there. They weren't even kneeling, they were standing up, they're getting in the way, they had their shoes on, it was a whole thing. And right away, my mind was like, come on, I saw this mind of frustration happened right away. That was my first instinct. I was so frustrated. We were here for 3 days, and you come for the last 10 minutes, and you don't even ask politely, you just show up. And then I said, oh, that's nothing but anger. There's no benefit to that mind. They just want to be near the Guru. They want to see a Buddha. How wonderful is that? That's an incredible, incredible motivation. So why should I be angry at them? And how is that anger helping anyway? Even if they didn't deserve to be there, me being angry at them isn't changing anything because they're still there. So now I just have an angry mind when the Dalai Lama walks by. Right? So there's no use in that, right? It does nothing but hurt me. And it definitely doesn't change the situation in any meaningful way. But my first mind was that mind of frustration and anger. Luckily, I was able to see it. I noticed it. And then I developed an antidote. The mind that, how wonderful for them. They get to be near the Guru. Some of them are foreigners. They probably never had a chance to be near His Holiness before. Others were Tibetans who have such strong devotion and faith to His Holiness. Even being near them is, incredible for them. So when I felt that frustration arise and I saw it, I was able to counteract it with other minds, And the only reason I could see it or notice it is because I've done some small baby meditations, I haven't achieved anything in my meditation, I'm not a good meditator. My mind is a mess, but maybe some baby little bit I can see, especially when anger comes. Or at least I can see it more easily than before I started practicing. And so you notice the more you practice, you can see this. So this is one of the questions I was asked, and that is the practices become familiar with your mind. The only other thing I thought to mention before we go over the Bodhisattva vows and the ceremony is His Holiness just mentioned the Pratimoksha vows and the importance of them being the foundation or the basis. So the Pratimoksha vows are either the vows of a layperson. There's 8 types of Pratimoksha vows. The male and female layperson vows. Those are 2. Then there's the male and female novice monastics. There is the male and female fully ordained monastics. So then we're at 6. Then there's the intermediary vows for nuns. That makes 7. And then there's the one-day vows. So there's 8 different types of Pratimoksha vows. So for most people here, you'd be taking the vows of a layperson or a householder. They're called genyin. Okay? And that is your basis. For the others of us, it's the monastic vows. One of the different types of monastic vows. That's our Pratimoksha vow. So that serves as the basis. They often say that is the outer practice, is those vows. So for a layperson, you have 5 vows as a householder. Not killing, not stealing, not lying, not engaging in sexual misconduct, and not consuming intoxicants. Now, whenever His Holiness teaches in the West, he often says that last one, maybe just take less intoxicants. He says, you should be able to have a vow not to take any. But if that seems too heavy to you, and that causes you to not take the vows at all, then okay, just take less. But the real vow is to not take any. And there's lots of stories about that one actually, because the first 4 vows are considered root vows. And if you break them, completely break them in all ways, then you've actually given up the Pratimoksha vows entirely. And so consuming alcohol or other intoxicants isn't a root vow. And so there's a story of a monk who thought, oh, it's okay for me to take alcohol because it's not a root vow, it's not a problem. But then as a result of that, he committed all the other 4. He got in a fight and he killed someone, he engaged in sexual misconduct, he lied, he stole. So even though taking intoxicants itself isn't a root vow, it leads to the other vows being broken quite easily, which is why it's important. And if our goal is to become familiar with our mind, taking any substance that creates distance in our mind, makes cloudiness of mind, is not moving us forward in our goal. So that's the reason that is advised. And then we even see in the Vinaya text for monks and nuns what medicines we can take and what permission there is. So in the Vinaya text, there's medicines that contain alcohol, and the Buddha says, well, you can take them if they're diluted to this extent. So by taking them, they don't affect your mind. And there's even a mention of taking cannabis, a cannabis tea for people that have stomach problems. And again, the Buddha said you can take if it has no effect on your mind. So we recognize that sometimes things that can help us, like a medicine, can also hurt us if taken in the wrong way. So the idea of intoxicants, it goes with that. Anyway, those are the 5 vows of a layperson, and those are the pratimoksha vows. Those are the basis, the outer practice. Then the inner practice is the bodhisattva vows, which is what you took today. And it's an inner practice because it's guiding all of our activities, but we don't need to declare it to the world, But it still guides everything we do. And it's built upon those vows of not killing, of not stealing, of not engaging in sexual misconduct, of not lying. And then the secret practice is the tantra vows, if you engage in tantric meditation. So you have outer, inner, and secret. And so today we learned about the inner vows, the bodhisattva vows. So this book, very helpful. Again, available for free. If you go to shop.fpmt.org, search for bodhisattva vows, you can download this. It contains all of the 18 root bodhisattva vows as well as the 46 branch, and gives a little bit of explanation for all of them. It also includes the 4 conditions that we're going to talk about, and it includes the prayer or ceremony to restore the vows if you break them. So it's very, very helpful. And again, FPMT makes it available for free. We couldn't print them out for everyone, but so it's just called the Bodhisattva vows, and that's what I'm going to be using as I go through. What this doesn't have in it is the 12 lines that you recited today. There's another text available called Taking the Bodhisattva Vows and the Tantric Vows. They combine them into one text that has these lines, but I'll go through them again right now. So first, going through the 12 lines, I'll go through the ceremony first. Bodhisattva vows are uncommon in that you don't actually have to take them from a guru. The pratimoksha vows and the tantric vows, you need to take directly from a guru. You can restore them on your own, but you need to take them directly from a guru. Bodhisattva vows, you can take them from a visualized guru. Now, you all had the opportunity to take them from His Holiness today, so it doesn't matter for your circumstances. But it's interesting that the one type of vow that we can take through the power of visualizing a guru in front of us. And so this is the practice His Holiness does every day, is that he recites these 12 lines. And so you visualize yourself actually receiving the vows as you recite these 12 lines. And so the way you visualize that is you start by generating a mind of compassion, right? A mind wishing to take bodhicitta, to develop bodhicitta of some sort. So you do a short meditation to just generate that feeling. And then you visualize in front of you your guru. So you can visualize your guru, if it's Dalai Lama, in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha. That's often the easiest for many people. Or you can just visualize Shakyamuni Buddha if that's more comfortable for you, But you visualize the guru in front. And today His Holiness advised us to visualize that Buddha surrounded by the lineage masters like Nagarjuna and Dharmakirti and so forth, all the other bodhisattvas, all the other holy beings that practice this path. But the main visualization is the guru. Whether that's the guru in the guru's own form or in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha, or if you have another tantric practice in the form of that Buddha, you visualize them in front. And usually if your body allows it, you kneel on your right knee, If that's not possible, whatever position is possible, but you should visualize yourself as if you were kneeling on your right knee, because that's a position of veneration. And then with your hands clasped together, you recite these 12 lines 3 times. And at the conclusion of the 3rd one, you actually visualize the vows coming from your guru and taking firm root in your body. You've actually received the vows at the completion of the third line. And now you all already have the vows, but still you do this meditation every day, and that just A, keeps them fresh in your mind, right? And B, it just makes them stronger. And so that's why as one is recommended doing it every day. And so the 12 lines we have here, the first 4 are referencing what's called wishing bodhicitta, or aspiring bodhicitta. So we say there's 2 types of conventional bodhicitta, wishing and then engaged. So engaged bodhicitta is the actual doing of something. So it's bodhicitta that is conjoined with an activity of the perfections, an activity working for the benefit of others. And then wishing bodhicitta is exactly what it sounds like. It's just wishing to do that, wishing to become a Buddha for all sentient beings, but not being engaged with another sentient being. So it's often just described as the difference between wanting to go to the store and going to the store, right? It's exactly what it sounds like, wishing and engaged. But they're both levels of bodhicitta, so we develop them both. We develop wishing bodhicitta first, and then based on that, we develop engaged bodhicitta. So the first 4 lines are referencing wishing or aspiring bodhicitta. I take refuge in the 3 jewels. I confess all my individual misdeeds. I rejoice in the virtue of all transmigrating beings. And I embrace the mind of enlightenment. I take refuge in the 3 jewels. I confess all individual misdeeds. I rejoice in the virtue of all transmigrating beings, which is to say all sentient beings. And I embrace the mind of enlightenment. I embrace bodhicitta. This is the first 4 lines. Kunchok sumla da kapche. Dikpa tamche sososhak. Joe gela jeiram. Sanke chanchu yigizon. If you want to recite them in Tibetan. And then we have 8 lines referencing the engaging bodhicitta. To the Buddha, Dharma, and Supreme Assembly, I go for refuge until I am enlightened. In order to fulfill the aims of myself and others, I will generate the mind of enlightenment. Those are the first 4 of the 8. So this is very similar to the prayer we do at the beginning of our time together. Yeah? Not the same words, but very similar. To the Buddha, Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. In order to fulfill the aims of myself and others, I will generate the mind of enlightenment. Having developed the mind of supreme enlightenment, and toward all sentient beings, my invited guests, I shall act with supreme enlightened conduct. May I become a Buddha to benefit all transmigrating beings. Having developed the mind of supreme enlightenment, toward all sentient beings, my invited guests, I shall act with supreme enlightened conduct. May I become a Buddha to benefit all transmigrating beings. Sangye chudan sojokla, chanchu baru, dani kapsuki. Rangshin dini rapukir, chanchu samni kepaki. Chanchu kloki samni ke gine, senshin tamse dadi jondunya. Chanchu kluko yon kepaki, jola pincher sanke drupar shok. And so that last line is very important, right? Whether in English or Tibetan, it doesn't matter. But that last line, at the 3rd repetition of that last line, is when you actually visualize yourself receiving the vows. So that's the practice His Holiness encouraged us to do every day. So yesterday, we took the commitment from His Holiness to do the all yoga mind generation every day. And today, we took the commitment to do these bodhisattva vows every day. And, you know, His Holiness sometimes can be sneaky. You don't realize you're going to be committed to do something when you go receive a teaching. And then you leave with something you weren't ready for, which is wonderful. I attended a teaching once with His Holiness at Gyume Monastery. He's giving a oral transmission of a text called The Debate Between Self-Grasping and Wisdom. And it was mostly monks there. And then he's like, I think I'll give a transmission of the Guru Puja. Okay. So then he gave a transmission of the Guru Puja, and he said, good, now every day you have to recite that you have this commitment. And so we all said, oh, thank you. I think it's probably most beneficial to do this meditation first, and then the all yoga mind generation. But you can see which is more useful for you. But in my practice, this seems the more logical way to go. You start with this, and then based on that, you do the visualization that was talked about yesterday. So I'm going to go through the 18 root vows very quickly. Won't go through the 46 secondary vows. I'll just give you a brief overview of them. The thing to remember, it seems really overwhelming, right? All of a sudden now you have these 18 vows you have to follow, and then 46 branch vows. That's a lot. Seems overwhelming. The truth is, if you try to live your life with a mind of bodhicitta, you don't even have to think about these vows because you do them naturally. So that's the truth of having vows like this, is that it seems like there's a lot, but in truth, the natural extension of bodhicitta. And so the reason we take these vows explicitly is because they help us protect our bodhicitta, and they help make our bodhicitta minds stronger. But don't feel overwhelmed as you go through them. First off, a lot of them kind of overlap. Not a lot, but at least some. And then secondly, you'll realize most of these you're already kind of doing. So now you just have the intention, the mental activity of doing them, and makes it more powerful. So in this text by Lama Zopa, he first talks about the different ways to think about aspiring bodhicitta and how to guard that from degenerating in this life, and how to maintain it and enhance it for future lives. So there's no vows associated with aspiring bodhicitta. The vows are actually associated with engaging bodhicitta, but he still gives advice for that in this text. And so then engaging bodhicitta, we have the 18 root vows. So the first one is praising yourself or belittling others out of either attachment to receiving compliments or out of jealousy towards others. So praising yourself or belittling others out of attachment or jealousy is the first. The second is, even though you are able, not giving material aid to others due to miserliness. Okay. And again, it's important to recognize that it has to have the intention of miserliness. If you don't give to others because you don't know they need something, that's not the same thing. If you have this mind that says, I don't want to give, this is mine, and then not giving when you have the capacity to, that's the second one. The third is not forgiving others, but instead harboring a grudge and holding it, even if they apologize. And this has to especially be with an intention of anger. Okay, so not forgiving others out of anger. This is the third root vow. And then abandoning the Mahayana teachings. So the teachings on emptiness and the teachings on bodhicitta. Abandoning them and or kind of changing them and teaching your own version of them. Such as saying, oh, it's okay to engage in immoral behavior, as long as you do it with a good mind. These kind of things. So you take a real teaching and then you pervert it just a little. That's one way. Or saying these teachings aren't true. That's the other way. Okay. So abandoning the Mahayana teachings, the teachings on both the emptiness of true existence and of bodhicitta. Then the fifth is either taking back offerings you've made to the Buddha, Dharma, or Sangha, or stealing things that were intended for the 3 jewels of refuge in some way. So for most of us, if we're already not stealing, then we got a head start on this one. But the other thing to be careful is, if you are planning to go to a puja, let's say, and you buy offerings for that puja, and then you're in the car and you're a little hungry, so you say, well, I'm just going to eat 1 apple, that's okay. But you've already bought these with the intention to give them to the 3 jewels. And so that's actually taking away something that's already been given, mentally given. So it's a little thing to be careful for. But for the most part, it's pretty easy, I hope, not to steal from the 3 jewels. See, you don't even have to worry about this one. It's natural. That's 17. You don't even have to worry. Okay. The sixth one is abandoning or despising the holy Dharma by criticizing the scriptures or criticizing the practices, any of the three vehicles. So that's not just criticizing Mahayana teachings, but it's also criticizing the Hinayana teachings or the practices that go into, these days we say Theravadan or Hinayana practice. Okay, so criticizing both the teachings and the practice. That's the sixth one. Seventh is causing any harm to an ordained person, or stealing from an ordained person, or engaging in activity that would cause them to lose their vows of ordination. That's the seventh. The eighth is committing any of the 5 heinous activities or actions. So these 5 actions are killing your father, killing your mother, killing an arhat, which is a being who has achieved liberation, lower liberation from samsara, intentionally wounding a Buddha, or creating a schism in the community of monks and nuns. So again, it's usually pretty easy not to do those things, but in case you needed it, you know, it's one of these vows you've now taken. They're called heinous actions because they're so heavy that if you don't engage in the correct activities to purify it, they say you're immediately reborn in the lowest of hell realms. You know, do not pass go, do not collect $200. As soon as you die in this life, there's no break. In Tibetan, they're actually called samme, which means there's no border, you know, uninterrupted. But it doesn't make sense to say the uninterrupted actions. So that's why we translate it as the heinous actions. But it really means uninterrupted. There's no boundary. That's how heavy it is. Then the 9th is cultivating or holding wrong views, such as sectarianism, such as a view that denies the existence of the 3 jewels, or such as a view that denies the truth of the law of karma. The 10th is destroying any town or country, or any place that is inhabited by people, such as a house or whatnot. So any place that is inhabited by beings that you destroy, that's breaking the vow. The 11th is teaching emptiness to those who are untrained or not ready for it. This can cause them to develop ideas of nihilism, to develop wrong views, which is why it's dangerous. So we have a vow not to teach it to those that are not prepared. The 12th is turning someone away from enlightenment and encouraging them to work only for their own benefit. So if there's someone doing an activity that is a Mahayana activity, and you say, you know, that's really difficult, why don't you just take a day off? Or why don't you just go, you know, have an ice cream, relax? You're actually discouraging their virtuous Mahayana activity. In doing that, that is breaking a vow. The 13th is encouraging others to abandon their pratimoksha vows. Again, the same mind, saying those are so difficult to keep all of. Why don't you just go to the bar and have a good night, you know, for once? You know, so that's encouraging others to abandon their pratimoksha vows. That's the 13th. 14th is causing others to hold incorrect views about the lower vehicles or belittling the lower vehicles. So this is very similar to earlier we said you have a vow not to criticize the scriptures or the practices of any of the other types of Buddhist practice, including the Hinayana. And this is belittling it in such a way that would cause others to develop a criticism for it, or saying things about it that are incorrect, you know. Now, as part of our practice and study, we say that if you practice one of these schools, you won't become a Buddha, right? That you won't achieve perfect, complete enlightenment. The best you'll do, which is still pretty good, but the best you'll do is achieve this liberation, right? You'll become an arhat. But eventually, even from there, you still have this subtle suffering that has to be removed so you can become a Buddha. So we do teach in that way. And our teachings do criticize those practices, but they criticize them on the basis that this is the Mahayana practice. It's not criticizing them saying it's an invalid practice. So that's an important thing to recognize. So if you hear a teacher or you read a text saying you shouldn't engage in this, that's not the same thing, okay? So we don't belittle them. There's no unfounded critique or causing others to have negative understandings of the lower vehicles. 15 is to proclaim false realizations of emptiness, to say that you have some realizations that you don't have, especially regarding emptiness. 16 is accepting gifts or material that you know has been stolen from the 3 jewels or from a fully ordained monk or nun. 17th is what we have written here is actually an example of it. So written, what is in this book says, taking material from someone who is meditating on calm abiding and then giving it to someone else who's merely reciting texts. But the vow itself is creating an unfair or biased practice. So it's saying, oh, this person who's doing this one practice doesn't need something, I'm going to take it and give it to someone else, but based out of your own bias. Or saying, I'm going to give teachings to all those who are big sponsors, and I'm not going to give teachings to those who can't afford to sponsor me in some way. So creating a bias in your practices, especially in your practices of sharing the Dharma, but also in your worldly practices as well. You know, having this biased mind. That's the 17th. And the 18th is abandoning bodhicitta by thinking, I cannot help sentient beings, or I don't want to help this particular being. That's the hard one, right? If there's any one being who you say, I don't want to help them, that's abandoning bodhicitta. If you actually believe that, if you develop that mind. And that is I think, one of the hardest one to keep. It's easy to keep this general idea of bodhicitta, but when there are direct examples in front of you of really harmful people, it can be hard to say, I want to help this person, and not have the mind, I don't want to help this person. So those are the 18 root vows. I know I went over them quickly. They're pretty self-explanatory. And if you look online, you can get this book. I'm sure there are other resources as well. There's a number of books that have been written by great lamas explaining these in more detail. But the important thing to remember about them is to break a root vow, you have to have 4 conditions. Okay? So the 4 conditions are, you fail to regard that the action is wrong. So just because you do it, if you recognize that this is a wrong action, then you haven't completely broken the vow. You have a partial break of the vow, but not a complete break. Okay? It's important because if you break one of these vows, you lose all 18 of the bodhisattvas. So that's why it's important to understand this distinction. So if you fail to regard the action as wrong, that's the first condition. And you have to have abandoned the thought not to want to do the action again. So not only do you break it, not only do you think this was an okay thing for me to do, you don't have any regret about doing it. And then you actually are happy. You generate some sort of rejoicing or admiration for the action. So the example he gives is if you break the first vow, right, which is not belittling others or praising yourself. If you break that and you say, you feel this idea, oh, you know, how nice it was that I could show off my good qualities. That's an act of rejoicing in the breaking of a vow, right? And then the 4th condition is having no shame or consideration, which is to say, having no recognition that this is a harmful action that you don't want to do. And that you don't care about the consequences of this harmful action. So in order to break a root vow, it has to have these 4 conditions to be totally broken. You have to not have regarded the action as wrong. You have to have not developed the mind that you don't want to engage in this action again. You have to actually rejoice or be happy that you completed this action. And you have to have no fear about the consequences of that action. So if you don't have all 4 conditions, then you haven't lost your bodhisattva vows, you've only weakened them. And then you can do a practice to help restore them, which I mentioned it the other day, the 4 opponent powers practice. I'll mention it briefly again. But if you have broken your bodhisattva vows, then you have to engage in a different type of practice to totally restore them, you know? And that's all talked about in this text. So I don't know if I need to go through that, especially because His Holiness didn't, but that's just something to be aware of, okay? It needs to have these 4 conditions to be totally broken. Now that's not true for 2 of them. The 9th one, cultivating wrong views, and the 18th one, abandoning bodhicitta, even doing those in the mildest way, causes you to lose all 18 vows and to no longer hold the vows in your continuum. And if you think about it, that makes sense. If you give up bodhicitta, then of course it doesn't have to have these 4 conditions. Once you give it up, all 18 vows are gone. And it's the same with holding wrong views. It says that by holding a wrong view like this, you've changed your outlook to such a degree that you've lost all 18 vows. And so I won't go through all the 46 because I want to have time for questions, because I spoke for far longer than I anticipated. But I will just say that the way they're organized is we talked about the 6 paramitas, or the perfected activities of bodhisattvas, right? I mentioned it earlier. If you study Shantideva's text, or when you study Shantideva's text, you'll see these clearly laid out. The practice of generosity, of discipline, of patience, of joyful effort, concentration, and wisdom. And so most of the 46 vows are related to one of those. So the first 7 are all related to generosity, you know? And so one of the ones that's worth pointing out is through hatred or laziness, not giving an answer or giving a distorted answer when someone asks you a question sincerely, if you're capable of answering it, you know? And this isn't as heavy as a root vow, but it's still something that a bodhisattva would never do, which is why we don't do it. That's the point of this vow. We need to live our lives like bodhisattvas. Okay. Then there are another 8 or so that deal with morality. One of them that I think is quite important to think about is if you can perform an action that is of benefit to others, but you don't do it because of a strict adherence to your Vinaya, which is your monastic rules, then that's actually a downfall of a bodhisattva. And the example you hear quite often is, you know, and this is done at the expense of the Hinayana school, but this is the example they give, is that there are 2 monks walking through the forest and they come to a lake or a stream rather, that they have to cross. And there's a woman who needs to get across, but she can't because it's too rapidly flowing, the stream. And so she begs them to help her. And the first one says, I'm sorry, I'm not, you know, fully named monk, I'm not allowed to touch a woman. It's against my vows. And so he just leaves her on the bank and he goes across. And the other monk just very silently picks her up, puts her on on his shoulders, and he carries her across. And so by doing so, he technically broke this fine element of his vows. But he had a Mahayana attitude, and the attitude was to benefit others. And so if he hadn't done that, he would have been breaking this vow. And the way that story is usually told is the first monk looks at him and goes, what are you doing? How could you carry that woman? And he goes, what woman? The one I put down on the bank? I let her go. You're still carrying her. That's how that story usually is told. But that's an example of, now it's not a major vow, right? It's not breaking one of the major vows, but to say there's an opportunity for me to help other beings, but due to a small vow, I won't do it. And I use that as my excuse not to help others. Otherwise, I have all the resources I need. Then that's actually breaking the bodhisattva vow. Excuse me, a branch vow, not a root vow, a branch vow. Then again, there are some vows related to patience. There are some vows related to diligence, concentration, and wisdom. And then the last one, there's a group of vows at the end that are related to the perfection of the morality of helping others. And these all, for the most part, really fall under the category of generosity, I think. But in any case, those are the last ones. And so you can understand them in these groups. And it's important to know all of them. And as you go through, what I've done and what I would advise you to do is some of them, like I said, will be natural to you. Some of them would never cross your mind that you'd ever do this thing in the first place, right? And so you don't have to worry about those vows. But then the ones that are a little more difficult, those ones you highlight and you say, oh, these are the ones I really need to work on. And then you draw attention to the ones that have a little dissidence to your mind. And then you can be more active in your practicing of those. Because the purpose of all these vows is to live like a bodhisattva, is to bring us all happiness, to remove all suffering, and to create all the conditions that we might remove the suffering of all sentient beings. When you take vows, it isn't to hold you back. It isn't to hold you down. It isn't to cause you distress. It's to create happiness in your life. That's the reason we take vows. You know, that's why you can be a monk or a nun with all these hundreds of vows and rejoice at the vows, because they bring happiness to your life. And so the same with these vows. It seems like a lot. 18 root vows, 46 secondary branch vows. So it seems like a lot. But just think, every vow you take is a mental activity. And every mental activity is a new opportunity to create virtue and to benefit others. And so all these ones that are easy, you just create virtue without even doing any work. You just think about it and it's there. You know, there's a big difference between not killing and taking a vow not to kill. Because one of them has a strong mental activity that is happening at the same time, and one is happening by accident. So in the same way, now that you've taken these vows, you have these mental activities, you're creating positive karma all the time by having these in your continuum. So it's really powerful that way. So you should rejoice that you have this opportunity. And I rejoice that you have this opportunity. Okay, let's do some Q&A if there's any questions. And that way I can stop rambling. Yeah.
You mentioned the dangers of practicing exchanging self and others. What are the dangers if we don't?
So I mentioned that the practice of exchanging self and others as a way to generate bodhicitta was kept secret because it was considered, it could be dangerous to some extent. And what I mean by dangerous is that if you don't understand the technique, then it can, similar to other Lojong teachings, it can seem like you're seeking out suffering. And it can encourage you to engage in behavior that seems to actually seek out suffering. And so the practice, any of our Lojong, our mind transformation practices, we don't seek suffering. There's more than enough suffering to go around. We don't need to look for it. But what we're saying is, since the suffering exists, how can I use this to transform my mind? And in this meditation, when you take suffering from others, you do so in such a way that you're creating this mental habit, but you're not seeking out suffering for yourself. The other danger is that it's easy to think that I don't matter at all. If you're saying other people are more important than me, and you're really cultivating that idea as explicit mindset, which is what happens when you equalize self and others, then you can develop a very kind of sempam, like a depressed mind, kind of. And that mind can then lead you to not want to practice anymore. And so it can become an obstacle to your practice. If you develop this kind of depressed mind that says, I don't matter at all, I'm not important, I'm insignificant, you know, I'm not worthy of anything. Those are actually a type of laziness, we say, those depressed minds. But so if you don't recognize that that's a danger, then that can happen by this practice. But if you know the benefits of the practice and you realize that that's not the point, then it's easy to avoid that, I think, which is why this practice has been taught more publicly, you know, since the mind training practices became more popular, this also started being taught publicly. So that's my impression. Yeah, okay. Are you looking at the online questions or should I look at them?
There's no questions.
Oh, okay, okay. Yeah.
And you're describing the soaking of the mind, various stages and putting the future. Where does knowledge come from? Who was there? Who's catching knowledge? Who was somebody who could be there to be able to record and tell that?
So the question is, we talk about these 8 dissolutions of mind, especially these most subtle minds. How do we know this? Like, where did we get this information from? And the answer is that there are yogis and practitioners who have gone through this process and have been able to teach it to others, or through their meditative power, they've realized it in themselves before they actually passed away. So there are teachers who have high levels of meditative equipoise, who have been able to recognize the nature of how our mind works, and through that, they're able to teach it. And then, as students, we're able to observe it, analyze it, use logic, use our experience, and then determine the validity of it. So for someone like me, the idea of the 8 dissolutions, I don't have any experience of those in my own life because I don't have that level of meditative realization. So, but I don't take it on blind faith because I have all these other teachings regarding the mind that I've studied, that I've developed conviction in, and I've seen my teachers and I have conviction in their teachings because I have listened to them for many years and seen the truth and validity of what they teach. And so based on those 2 things, I have confidence in the description of the dissolutions of mind, even though I don't yet have a direct realization of it. And so we trust that there are lamas and teachers who have been able to engage in deep meditative realization, and then they share those experiences with us. And then once they share them, other scholars, other teachers, other meditators check and see if it kind of lines up. And then that's how we verify them in that way. So it does require a little bit of faith, but we say it's not blind faith. It's faith based on our experience and based on our intellect and our understanding. Yeah, well, because those levels of mind exist all the time, right? So that most subtle clear light mind exists right now, but I have so many coarse minds, I can't actually realize it. But if I have developed a strong meditation, a meditative practice, then I can actually recognize all the most subtle types of minds that exist in my mental continuum. So that's how. It's not that people have gone to death and then come back, though that is possible in some cases. But that's not what we're talking about. It's that I've developed enough level of people, meditators, developed enough level of meditative equipoise that it can actually see all the different levels of coarse minds and subtle minds and how they build one on top of the other. So that's the experiences that they then share and then are investigated. So that's the way. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the review. The name in English of the two texts from Nagarjuna and
Yeah.
Holiness mentioned yesterday.
Mm-hmm. So the two texts by Nagarjuna, in English, it's usually called the root verses on the middle way, or root verses, or the root verses of wisdom on the middle way, or on the Madhyamaka. Sometimes they say Madhyamaka means middle way. So that's Nagarjuna. And that's really hard to read on its own. I suggest reading a commentary. One great commentary in English is by Tsongkhapa. That's called Ocean of Reasoning. And so that's Tsongkhapa's explanation of Nagarjuna's treatise. And that was translated by J. Garfield in Gishino and Sampan. I don't know, there may be other translations as well, and maybe other commentaries as well, but that's one that is quite clear. And then Chandrakirti's text, which is itself a commentary on Nagarjuna's text, but it's still really hard to understand and is written in verse, is called Entering the Middle Way in English. It's called Entering the Middle Way. And Tsongkhapa's commentary on that is called Illuminating the Intent, and that's also translated into English. There are other commentaries as well translated, but those are the two that I've read, those translations, and they're very helpful. So Entering the Middle Way by Chandrakirti and the root verses of wisdom of the Middle Way by Nagarjuna. Those are the texts. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned that there is one separate part of the mind or the consciousness that is carrying the impression and the karma from one life to another. The Dalai Lama mentioned yesterday there is no soul, according to Buddhism, there is no soul or there is no atma. So what is the difference?
That's a great question. The question is, we mentioned how the clear light mind, the subtle clear light mind, moves from one life to the next. And that's how we have a continuum of unbroken lives. And that's how karma that is created in one life ripens in a future life. Yet, Buddhism is distinct in that it doesn't believe in there being a soul or an Atman. So what is the difference between a soul and this subtle clear light mind that goes from one life to the next? And the big difference, we say, is that the idea of a soul, especially an Atman, as is described in contradiction to what the Buddha taught, is that it has some permanent essence. A soul has some unchanging essence that is a defining characteristic of the being that it's associated with, and that we don't have such a thing, because any self that we identify is merely labeled self. It's a mere I that is always dependent on causes and conditions and doesn't exist truly. But the idea of a soul is something that truly exists, so it is not changing. So that's the difference. That's the idea, is that a soul will be something that's permanent and doesn't have the ability to change, and doesn't have any cause. But the subtle clear light mind is constantly changing and is not permanent and is not truly established. So that's how the Buddhists distinguish. I will say, especially when you study, if you don't have a strong understanding of emptiness, as most of us don't, that's a hard distinction to make. And so for me, what I do, especially because I grew up in the West with this idea of a soul, this permanent soul, I realize the flaws of that as taught by the Buddha. And even if I don't have a strong understanding of emptiness, so I still have doubts, but I have an intellectual understanding. And so based on my intellectual understanding, I can engage in meditation and try to develop my understanding and my reasoning. So, it slowly builds, but it doesn't happen all at once. I really wish it did, but yeah.
I think before you said that Theravada tradition doesn't believe or doesn't really follow the Bodhicitta concept, and the question is why is that?
So it's just regarding the Theravada tradition. and then they don't follow bodhicitta. So why is that? So the Hinayana practitioners, as taught, focus only on their own liberation from suffering. And so there are strong ideas of compassion taught by the Theravada tradition. And there is the mind that wants to help other beings. And depending on the lineage, some emphasize that more than others. There's definitely strong elements of compassion and of non-harming. But bodhicitta itself is the saying, I will become a Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings. So every single activity I do is for the benefit of others and not my own freedom from suffering. And their tradition says, my main goal is for me to be free from suffering. So that's the distinction. And so that's why they might have a mind that's similar to bodhicitta in any individual practitioner, because it's very strong compassion, that's possible. But bodhicitta itself is the conviction, I will do this for the benefit of all other beings, not for my own happiness. So they don't cultivate that level of mind. They can cultivate similar things, but not the exact same. Not like that. Yeah.
There were two other questions that we lost with the answer of the very well.
Oh, okay.
One of them, I think, was about blind or having pets, and the other one was about compassion. The person who said that he felt that it's hard for him to grow compassion for others.
In general, yeah. So,
What was the answer? For that?
yeah. So during the Q&A today, some of the questions didn't seem to be clearly answered, and that's just being brought up. And I will say some of that is because His Holiness didn't always give direct answers. He was speaking around the question because he felt that was more useful. And other times it may have been the translator didn't get all the pieces. You never know. So the two questions you brought up is one regarding animals or stray pets, and the other one is regarding a student who said it's difficult. He feels like it's difficult to develop compassion in general. So regarding pets, what His Holiness mentioned is, since we're human beings, we have this capacity for understanding and awareness that animals don't have, which we have to make sure we use and we don't waste. And that was his main thing, is that we have a capacity for understanding that animals don't have. And so the general advice regarding animals and regarding anyone is you use skillful means. So if you have the ability to help to reduce the suffering of animals, then you do, but you have to be skillful about it. So for instance, as was mentioned, any of you who came, we just recently did a course the last 3 days before His Holiness's teachings, and they mentioned here to Shida that they have 15 new puppies here, and taking care of 15 puppies is incredibly difficult and isn't something that Tushita is able to do, right? So if you could, obviously the best opportunity was to give these 15 puppies everything they could ever have, to have as little suffering as possible, right? They're still going to be suffering, they're still animals, they're still in samsara, but you could try to do everything. But Tushita doesn't have those resources. So instead, the best they can do is try to find homes for these puppies. They've already given them, they've had all of them given shots. They're trying to get them all spayed and neutered to help prevent future outbreaks of puppies. But then after that, the best they can do is try to find them good homes, because we raise 15 puppies here. It's not possible. So then you see, what is in my ability to do? What is skillful and what can I do? And that's how we should approach almost any difficulty in our life, Like I said, if you want to make donations to help people who are impoverished, right? Either they're hungry or they're unhoused, just driving down the street and throwing money out your window isn't going to be helping them, right? But if you use that money and give it to an organization that does work in those situations, then that can be more beneficial. So the same activity of giving money away, one of it can be done using wisdom, and one is done in a stupid way. So when helping other animals, we realize that as humans, we have an uncommon capacity for intellect and reasoning, and therefore we help them as best we can, given the circumstances. So that's kind of the answer for that. I wish it was easier, but for instance, there's so many monkeys, right? And we're told here to Shida, don't feed the monkeys. You might think it's compassionate to be giving the monkeys food, but all you're doing is creating the habit for the monkeys to then approach humans. And when they don't get food from someone, then they hurt them. And there's students of people, even at Tushita, getting hurt by monkeys because they try to pet the monkeys, they try to do whatever, and these are monkeys, they can be dangerous. But because other people have given them food, they taught these monkeys, oh, it's okay to come. So what you think is an act of compassion, giving this monkey a meal, is actually creating a habit that leads to harm. So you have to be smart about things. And plus, all the monkeys around here you see are quite fat and don't need any more food, luckily. So it's not like we're depriving them. They clearly have food sources. So that's that regarding animals. The second one, how to develop compassion. He just mentioned that, what was his one? His answer. His answer had to do with the fact that we develop compassion slowly, and we do it by reflecting on the suffering of other beings and how everyone is the same in wanting happiness, not wanting suffering, and yet they're under the power of delusion and karma, and therefore engaging in activities that create harm. They think they're following happiness, but they're really creating suffering. And so we bring that slowly into our meditation based on our own experiences of suffering and unhappiness. And based on that, we can see that acting in others' lives. And first, it starts on our meditation cushion. So it may not ever manifest in the real world right away. It just meditates when we're isolated. But the stronger we have that mind, the more familiar we become, then we actually develop bodhicitta or compassion. But his advice was just to meditate on it. He said, become familiar with it, which means meditate on it. So don't expect it to happen right away. Don't need to be like, now that I've taken bodhisattva vows, I've got compassion, I'm all set. You know, it has to be a continual process. Because until we become Buddhas, that means we can still develop deeper levels of mind, of all of our minds. All of our virtuous minds can become stronger until we become Buddhas, because that's when they become perfected. Okay, maybe 2 more questions.
This is a follow-up question about the pets. In extending that logic to human life, to say life is suffering, would it not make sense to say not create more life? Don't, like, the best thing you can do for your kids is to not create them. Instead, just adopt, since that life already exists.
Yeah.
And you can give your love and a good life and an opportunity for, say, moksha, nirvana, to that life that is already here.
So the question is, said as a follow-up of this idea, we were speaking about animals and whatnot, taking that same idea to human life, if we're really trying to prevent suffering, then wouldn't it be better not to create new life? Because all we're doing is causing new beings to be born into samsara and suffering, and instead adopt children who have already been born, and then do everything we can to give them the means to be free from suffering. And I've heard lamas give arguments on both sides. I've heard lamas say that it's probably best not to create new life, but when you tell that to people, they get really depressed. And if they're practicing the Dharma, at least if they do create a life and they have a child, they can teach that child the attitudes of the bodhisattva ideal. And so at least they're benefiting them in that way. And we say that the human rebirth is the perfect birth, right? And so maybe in the past birth, what was born as a child, as a human child, was an animal or something. And so now they've created the conditions for this perfect human rebirth, which then can be used. So that's one argument. And the others say, yeah, but there's all these other perfect human rebirths that are just waiting for a home. And that's a hard argument to argue with. It depends on how hardline you want to go, you know? I think it's a very important thing, even as a non-Buddhist, right? You just see there's so much suffering in the world. And not that, there's so many children that don't have homes, you know? Why do I need my genetic material to be passed on? Like, what's so important about that? And is that just a self-cherishing mind speaking that says my genetic material needs to go into the future? That's kind of the argument. It sometimes gets messy when people try to apply it in real life, because weird biological things happen and they develop this attachment and connection. So the advice is, look at the situation and the circumstances, do the best you can do. If you find yourself pregnant or having a child, then you raise them the best you can. If you really want a child, you don't find yourself pregnant and you can adopt and you have the means to do that, that's a wonderful thing to do as well. It's a, you know, there's a black and white answer there, but it's a little bit difficult to accept sometimes. Okay, I think our last question, because I'm sorry I went late, so we'll do
I want to know where is the limit. If you have a profession where you can help suffering, but there's so much suffering, so at some point you have to stop and say, I want more, you know, or have more. So this again is the both, because the last one is you say no more.
Yeah. So the question is, so say you're in a profession or a field where you do work to help alleviate other suffering. But there's at some point where you have to stop just because you're out of resources, be they physical or emotional resources. And so you have to stop and create a limit of some sort. Is that breaking this last vow that says I'm giving up the mind of bodhicitta? And so we'd say, if you're in a, let's say, a profession where you care for others, and you have to draw a strong line around what you can do without harming your ability to help others. It doesn't mean you stop the mind that wants to help all their beings. You still have the intention to benefit all sentient beings. But you realize in this life, I have limited resources and I need to use them as best I can. And if I'm constantly doing this, if I don't have the resources, emotional resources to not get burned out, to not get depressed, to not lose something, then I'm only doing a very minimal type of job. I need to have a big view, a long view. So in that way, we need to make sure that we are being as skillful as we can and never having a mind that says, I don't want to help others. It might be a mind that says, I recognize my resources are limited. This is how much I can do. And then I have to draw a line to protect myself and to ensure I can continue to help others in the future. But I still have the hope and the intention to help all beings and to include them all in my benefit as much as I can. So you never lose the mind that wishes to help others, even if your resources don't allow you to be infinite. We say our capacity for compassion and love is infinite, and we develop a mind of or immeasurable compassion and immeasurable love, as well as immeasurable joy and equanimity. Those are types of minds we actively try to develop because our mental capacity for that is infinite, but our resources at this point are not infinite. Yeah, well then, you see this is a big part of the Dharma practice, is knowing where's the line to say, can I really do more and I'm just being lazy? Or is this really where I need to stop to protect myself? So it's always good, you need to check, what is my motivation? Is it my self-cherishing mind that's just being a little lazy? Or is this really a hard limit? And if this is a hard limit, in the future, as I practice more, I try to push it a little further, But you always have to be on guard because it's very easy to say, since we're not Buddhas, I can't do everything, therefore I'm just going to do the bare minimum. And to create this kind of indulgence, that is easy. So we always need to try to push ourselves. Always check that our motivation is not the self-cherishing mind. And if you have to draw a line, a limit, you just analyze and see, is this really coming from the truth of my situation? Or am I being, following my own attachment of some sort? So that's why we engage in meditative practice, so we can analyze that. That is a danger. Since we're not perfect, we can't do everything. We do the best we can do, and we always try to do better. And then when we see where we have to stop, we just make sure that that's an actual limit and not something we're doing because we're lazy. If it's quick,
just a comment.
Yeah.
Sometimes instead of doing too little, sometimes doing too much is also a form of the self-cherishing mind.
Yep.
And then you're falling prey to the hero and savior complex.
Yeah. So doing too much can also be just indulging your self-cherishing mind. That's exactly right. Well, you're doing something out of the 8 worldly concerns, right? The 8 worldly concerns we've mentioned in past courses and in past reviews. But brief, there are these 8 mental activities or mental intentions that guide almost all of our activities. And they're grouped into 4 pairs. There are 4 things that we seek and 4 things we try to avoid. So most of our actions are due because we are seeking out pleasure, or we're trying to avoid pain, or because we're seeking out profit or gain, we're trying to avoid loss, or we're seeking out praise or compliments, and we're trying to avoid criticism, or we're seeking out fame, and we're trying to avoid notoriety or insignificance. And so we can have the outer appearance of trying to helping others, but really if we're doing it because I want people to have a good opinion of me, it's not a Dharma activity, it's a worldly activity. And you're actually causing harm because you're feeding your self-cherishing mind. That's exactly right. But that's why we have to always watch what our mind is, and why we're engaging in activities constantly. Because anything that follows one of the 8 worldly dharmas is not following virtue. It's not a Dharma practice, it's a worldly practice. And bodhicitta is the opposite of a worldly practice. There's nothing about bodhicitta that is worldly. It's pure virtue, pure Dharma. So they are contradictory. Okay, I think that's a good place to leave it. I hope I didn't create more confusion. We really do have to end, I'm sorry. But let's take a moment before we do, just to dedicate any merit we've accumulated. We hopefully have created some merit through our practice today. And in order to ensure our practice is virtuous in 3 ways, the beginning, middle, and end. It was virtuous in the beginning, as we created the intention to work for the benefit of others. It was virtuous in the middle, as we discussed the Holy Dharma with open and seeking minds. And now we will close our practice to be virtuous at the end by dedicating any merit we've accumulated to other sentient beings. So we recognize that through our practice, we've gained some small virtue, and we dedicate that to all beings who are suffering, that all beings who are suffering may be immediately freed from all suffering, experience the perfect bliss of Buddhahood. We especially dedicate it to those who have died, that they may quickly find a perfect human rebirth and a Mahayana teacher who leads them to perfect Buddhahood. And we dedicate it to all of our holy gurus. They may continue to display the aspect of long lives and continue to teach the Dharma. And we dedicate it to all those suffering sentient beings who have no other beings to pray for them. We take them in our hearts and in our minds. And we dedicate this so they may be free from all suffering. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to these review sessions, whether you're here in person or here online. I appreciate it. And thank you for attending teachings with Dalai Lama. Thank you for studying the Dharma and practicing. I rejoice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, from Tushita.
No.
We hope you'll come soon again
Thank
to
you.
us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And tomorrow, Venerable will start our introduction to Buddhism course, and we still have few places left. So if you want, you can register at our website.
Yeah. So that there's a 10-day course starting tomorrow, and